Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. European Council President António Costa has begun a crucial tour of EU capitals, testing whether governments can bridge deep divisions over the bloc's nearly €2 trillion budget for the 2028 to 2034. Now, from cohesion and agriculture to defense, Ukraine, and competitiveness, Europe's ambitions are colliding with fiscal realities. Joining us today on TVP World to assess whether that compromise is achievable is Iain Begg, Professorial Research Fellow at the London School of Economics, a leading expert on EU economic governance, cohesion policy, and budget reform. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening.
So it does seem like Costa wants an agreement on the next EU budget before the end of the year. Now, is that timetable genuinely achievable or mainly just a way of forcing the governments to some sort of compromise?
Well, there are two political things going on in the background, which is important to recognize. The first is that although every year there are going to be European elections, the ones coming in 2027 are more than unusually important. In particular, the French election in May is one that is likely to bring to power someone who may be a bit more hostile to the European Union than Emmanuel Macron. And then you have big elections in Italy, in Spain, and as you know, in Poland. So several of the big countries of the European Union are having elections simultaneously. A second, more cynical consideration is that Costa himself is due for reappointment in the middle of 2027, and he wants to be seen to be trying to get this deal done, so it's a feather in his cap. It's going to be difficult because there are so many opposing views, as there always are in this stage of trying to sort out the next multi-annual financial framework. There's a very nice French expression for this. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it's the same thing.
All right. Now, like I mentioned, there's a lot of direction things can go. Slovakia, for example, wants cohesion and agricultural spending. Estonia is talking about prioritizing defense, the eastern flank. Of course, Ukraine is all in the topic as well. Can all these different demands be accommodated without making the budget substantially bigger?
With great difficulty, because the only way you're going to be able to spend more on defense or defense-related elements of the EU budget is by cutting the two biggest programs which have dominated the EU budget over decades, that is agricultural support and cohesion policy support. Some of the opponents, like Slovakia, to cutting cohesion are part of a group called the Friends of Cohesion Policy, and they try to get together to say this is something we need to preserve in the budget. We know about the farmers, whether it's Polish farmers, Romanian farmers, French farmers, or Irish farmers. They always have a very clear agenda that they want to preserve the amount of money going to them, whereas the richer countries who pay in net terms for the European budget are reluctant to pay more. And this is especially difficult at a time when national fiscal stress is much more considerable than it has been in previous 7-year budgetary discussions.
Right, like you mentioned, there's a collision between national budget interests and even political and personal interests as well. Do you see the priorities shifting, or what kind of compromise do you think eventually will be reached in what is being prioritized first?
Well, there's a big shift of technology in this, if you can call it that, or governance, which is that the European Commission has proposed to embody everything within national, regional and partnership plans. This is a change from when agriculture stood alone or when cohesion policy stood alone, in that every single member state will be given a big chunk of money to spend on a series of things and will have some discretion about how to spend it. However, the big however in this is that there's going to be a global minimum to be spent on agriculture. There's going to be a global minimum to be spent on social policy, which is the European Social Fund, and there are protections for the cohesion policy components, which are effectively regional policy. So it's, on the one hand, trying to give more flexibility within these national plans, but at the same time saying they have to be spent on certain priorities of the European Union. And defence is rather low down the list of priorities. It's within what's called the new Competitiveness Fund. but it's only one of 4 ambitions within the Competitiveness Fund, which in total is going to be about 2%, 0.2% of EU GDP. That's around 20% of the EU budget.
Right. Speaking of this competitiveness fund, can you help us break it down a little bit? What does it entail, and do you think this would also have anything to do with the response to the growing Chinese competition?
To some extent, but it's split among 4 headings, of which the biggest one is defence and security related. Then there's digital, then there's trying to promote high tech in other areas, and so on, plus an element of space, which is to some extent linked to security. So 0.2 of a percentage point of EU GDP will be devoted to this competitiveness fund. It's unlikely to make a huge difference to competition with China, because China spends far, far more than that on promoting its own exports. And in any case, it's member states which have the budgets which are available to do this, rather than the EU level. So it's a nice idea. It's just not backed up by funds that are going to make a huge and strategic difference.
All right. So do you think there's any way that you can respond to the growing Chinese competition without necessarily retreating into protectionism or undermining the open economy on which much of Europe's prosperity actually depends on?
Well, there are 2 words which have been fairly dominant in EU politics in the last 3 or 4 years, and that's strategic autonomy. There is a desire in Europe to some extent close the door on the more intensive competition coming from other parts of the world, which tends to be code for China or China's satellites, who use the investment that China puts into their economies. So yes, there is that desire. The trouble is that Europe lags behind. It doesn't have the technological advantages of the United States in an area like artificial intelligence, or that China has developed over the last 10 years or so in relatively high technologies, rather than catch-up technologies that dominated the Chinese economy in the past. So the big challenge for Europe is, where does it come from? Is it the European level, or is it trying to bring together the member state levels who have budgets something like 40 times as large as the EU budget on a per capita basis, and try to mobilize that in a coherent way to try to do things collectively? The trouble is, when you have 27 countries in the European Union, it's very hard to get them together. The famous expression that I've heard used in this context is trying to herd cats.
All right, trying to get 27 countries together is very difficult indeed. And speaking of herding cats and getting countries together, I think there's another question to be raised. Whether a 7-year budget beginning in 2028 realistically can be designed without confronting the financial consequences of Ukraine possibly joining the European Union as well.
Well, it sounds daunting, Ukraine, but I've done the arithmetic. And if you count up all 9 candidate countries, including Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, the effect on the EU budget would be far smaller than many people have assumed. It would be like adding another 1.2 Romanias to the EU budget's demands. So it's not as daunting as it's sometimes assumed. It certainly is a challenge for the farming industry because of the extent of the power of the Ukrainian agricultural sector. And we've already seen tensions between bordering countries like Hungary and Poland saying they're uneasy with the success of Ukrainian agriculture, even though there's a war going on. But that's beyond the budget dimension. So I don't think the accession of Ukraine and a number of the other potential candidates is going to blow up the EU budget. It will pose questions about how that budget is distributed among agriculture and other policy areas.
Right. Now, we're looking at a headline figure of approaching 2 trillion euros, yet EU spending is actually remains tiny relatively to the size of the European economy. Now, it does want deeper, stronger defense, continued support for Ukraine, more industrial independence, but its common budget still remains relatively little more than 1% of its economy. Is there a fundamental mismatch between Europe's geopolitical ambitions and their willingness to pay for them?
Well, this is where the word Europe is very tricky, because Europe is the member states. And the member states do not, on the whole, want to give the EU level a much bigger budget. The European Parliament does. It would like to see the budget increase by maybe 1/10 or 2/10 of a percentage point of GDP. But even then, it's tiny. If you think of the US federal budget, it's something of the order of 23% of GDP, making it at least 20 times as big as the EU budget, illustrating a straightforward fact that Europe is not a federation, it's an intergovernmental organization which is a bit beyond something like the United Nations, but very different in character.
Right. Last but not least, going back to Costa, let's say if he does secure a deal by December, where do you think the compromises is most likely to come from? Larger cuts to more traditional programs or new EU revenues? How is it going to be achieved?
Well, new EU revenues is something of an illusion because of the way the EU budget is funded. The principal funding is direct payments by member states linked to their gross national product, or technically gross national income. If they create new revenue sources, the gross national product contribution would go down. So a new revenue source doesn't necessarily raise the amount available for the EU budget. In fact, I would go one step further and say the big decision on the EU budget is what the planned expenditure is, and then the revenue system follows. That makes it very difficult to say that creating new taxes or other revenue sources like the European emissions trading system is a way in which you're going to boost the capacity to spend of the EU budget. The spending decision is the primary one.
All right, so where do you think the compromises most likely going to come from?
Well, compromises will be what we now call the frugals. There were a frugal 4 last time round. They become a frugal 6, which is the countries which see themselves as the biggest net contributors who also want to see change. And we've seen this most forcefully coming from the German government recently, who said that 2 trillion should be cut by 20%. The Cyprus presidency of the European Union, which ended in June, proposed a cut of 2%. So that's a big gap to be filled. I think that the Germans will compromise it because in the end they always do. But their willingness to compromise is inhibited by the fact that they want to spend a lot more on defence. So they see a national problem, making it difficult to solve a European problem. And that means you have to look elsewhere. Probably the Competitiveness Fund will be the one to be sliced. I know it sounds crazy if you think that's the main objective, but the history of the EU budget in these 7-year negotiations has been that things like research and competitiveness-related ones are the easiest to cut because researchers cannot put tractors in the Rue de la Douane in Brussels, whereas farmers can and they block it. So farming is a very powerful lobby. The regions are a very powerful lobby. And there's a strong element of status quo in the EU budget, which means it's very difficult to move away from what people have. And there's a well-known phenomenon in behavioral economics. It takes far more effort to take €1 away from somebody than to give €1 to somebody, because the person who gets the €1 thinks, oh, great, fine. Whereas the person that loses €1 thinks, I object strongly.
Right. Definitely a very, very complicated Gordian knot to untangle. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.